Chapter 23 of Under Boy Scout Colors by Joseph Bushnell Ames. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23 A Surprise for Vedder. It was a distinctly informal council fire. There were no special stunts or games or competitions, as there would be later, merely songs, a few announcements, and finally, as the fire died down to glowing embers, a story or two. But Dale Tompkins had been rarely more perfectly content. Drawn together, perhaps, by the events of the afternoon and by the interesting secret they held in common, the members of Tent 3 were gathered in a group on one side of the circle. Whether by accident or design, Dale sat close to Ranny and a little behind him, where he could watch the play of light and shadow on the leader's handsome face. Scarcely a word passed between them, but Dale was conscious of something in the other's manner which made him wonder, with a thrill, whether the hateful barrier that had existed for so long between them wasn't growing a shade less formidable. Suppose some day it should vanish altogether. Suppose the time came when they could be real friends of the sort he had always dreamed about. He told himself that it was probably all imagination, but this did not take away his pleasure in the picture. And when Ranny, lazily shifting his lounging attitude, leaned carelessly back against the knees of the boys behind him, Dale thrilled to the touch almost as much as he would have done had he not felt the other to be quite unconscious of his presence. The routine of the second morning in camp was much the same as the first had been, but directly after dinner the fellows piled into boats and rowed out to where the Akita was anchored. As many as the power boat would hold went aboard, leaving the rest, with a large assortment of crab nets, hooks, lines, bait boxes, and the like, in the trailers. They made a hilarious bunch as they chugged upstream, past the straggling fishing village, under the bridge, and on between the low banks of sedge and tough water growth that lined the little river. But the noise was as nothing compared with the racket that began when they anchored and dispersed for the afternoon sport. Some took to the boats, others went ashore and fished from the bank, while a few stayed on the Akita. The tide was out, and it was an ideal spot for crabbing. In fact, the creatures were so plentiful that many of the boys abandoned the slower, more cautious method of luring them to the surface with bait, and took to scooping them off the bottom with nets, to the accompaniment of excited shouts and yells and much splashing of mud and water. They kept at it for about 2 hours, and when the whistle summoned them back to the motor boat, they brought along a catch big enough to furnish several meals for the entire camp. The last boat to come in was rowed by Dale Tompkins. Sanson and Benny Reed were with him, besides one or two others. But the interest and attention of those gathered on and about the Akita was swiftly centered on Harry Vedder, perched precariously on the stern seat. His fat legs were drawn up clumsily under him, his pudgy hands tightly gripped the sides of the craft, while his plump face was set in lines expressive of anything but joy. "What's the matter, Puffy?" called Ranny Phelps as they approached. "You look like Humpty Dumpty sitting on a wall." Vedder merely sniffed poutingly. The faces of Thompson and Sanson expanded in wide grins. "It's the crabs," chuckled the latter. "They're so fond of him they won't let him alone, you see," he added, his eyes dancing. "Some of 'em happened to get out of the box, and the minute they saw Humpty they got terribly attached to him." "Yes," snorted the plump youth indignantly, "to one of my legs, the beastly things! Hurry up, Dale, for goodness sakes! I'm all cramped up." A snicker went up from the other boats. "You ought to have spoken to 'em sharply, Ved," grinned Ranny, "and discouraged such liberties." "Yes," laughed Court. "Be firm with 'em." Vedder snorted again, and reaching for the rail of the Akita, climbed aboard with remarkable agility. "Maybe you think that's funny," he growled, taking possession of the most comfortable seat in sight, "but I'd rather tackle a snake any day than a boatload of crabs." He was so taken up with his own affairs that he quite missed the meaning glance that had passed between Court Parker and Bob Gibson as they fastened their painter to the stern of the power boat. He thought nothing, either, of the fact that they were the first ashore, where, hastening to remove from under one of the seats a medium-sized bait box covered with seaweed, they disappeared behind the cook shack. But later on, an uncomfortable suspicion came to him that there was something in the wind. Approaching the cook shack, where a crowd was occupied in breaking up shells and extracting crab meat for supper, he noticed Parker, Sanson, and Tompkins giggling and whispering with heads close together. As he came up, they stopped abruptly. But after supper he saw them again, clustered in a group with Gibson and Benny Reed, and caught a grinning glance from the latter that deepened his suspicion. "I'll bet they're up to some trick," he said to himself. Uneasily he kept a sharp lookout, determined that they should not catch him napping. But oddly enough, the joke, whatever it was, seemed to subside, and for all his watchfulness, Vedder failed to detect any more suspicious confabs during the evening. Nevertheless, he remained on guard, especially after dark. He did not stray far from headquarters without peering about for such pitfalls as taut ropes, water pails, and the like. At the council fire he selected his place with especial care, and saw that no one approached from behind without his knowing it. But the evening passed uneventfully, and when he had reached the tent in safety, and was undressing by the light of the single lantern, he decided he must have been worrying to no purpose. "Guess I was wrong after all," he thought, tying the pajama strings about his ample waist. "My, but bed's going to feel good." If there was one thing Vedder took pains about, it was in the arrangement of his blankets. To avoid the unpleasant exposure of toes, he had worked out an elaborate system of folds and safety pins until the combination resembled a sleeping bag more than anything else. It was his habit to attend to this immediately after supper, so that at bedtime there need be no shivery delay in getting fixed for the night. This evening he climbed ponderously to his perch, inwardly congratulating himself on his forethought, for the others, chattering busily on the day's doings, were only beginning to spread out their blankets. "It pays to be systematic," he thought complacently, and thrust his legs between the warm folds with a luxurious sigh of content. An instant later a howl of terror resounded through the camp, followed by a convulsive movement of Vedder's legs and body, which disrupted the neat arrangement in a flash. Dale Tompkins, sitting on the edge of the lower bunk, had no time even to roll aside before the fat boy, still gurgling with fright, landed on him with a crash that shook the tent. Chapter 23